The laughter and conversation in the roadside biker bar stopped instantly as the door creaked open. A small girl, no older than 10, stepped inside clutching a military service pistol too big for her hands. Her eyes, filled with determination beyond her years, scanned the hardened faces of the leather-clad veterans. "Which one of you knew my father?" she asked, voice barely a whisper, yet filling the silent room. The bikers froze, recognition dawning in their eyes as she pointed to a faded photograph on the wall. "That's him," she said. "You left him behind." The leader's face drained of color as he slowly stood. "From which city in the world are you watching this video today?" If stories of hidden truths and unexpected courage speak to you, consider subscribing to hear more about the extraordinary moments that change lives forever. The Rusty Spoke Bar stood like a defiant relic against the encroaching desert, 20 miles outside Millhaven, where Highway 23 stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Its weathered wooden exterior had survived 4 decades of sun and sandstorms, the neon sign flickering erratically as twilight settled across the landscape. In the gravel parking lot, a dozen motorcycles stood in formation, their chrome dull with road dust, but arranged with military precision. Inside, the Friday evening ritual unfolded with the predictability of a well-worn prayer. Cigarette smoke hung in layers beneath the low ceiling, mingling with the sense of whiskey, leather, and stories too heavy to carry alone. The jukebox played Creedence Clearwater Revival, the familiar melody providing a soundtrack to conversations that rarely ventured beyond safe territory. Behind the scarred oak bar, Trigger wiped glasses with a faded cloth, his movements economical despite arthritic hands. At 68, his face mapped a lifetime of hard roads and harder choices, silver beard neatly trimmed against weathered skin. The bartender's position suited him. Part gatekeeper, part confessor to the men who had followed him from combat zones to civilian life, a transition none of them had fully completed. "That tornado came straight down Main Street," Faulkner declared, gesturing with his whiskey glass for emphasis. "Lifted my bike clean off the ground, set it down 20 feet away without a scratch." At 63, he remained the group's storyteller, weaving tales that grew more impressive with each retelling, carefully avoiding the 3 years when he'd told no stories at all. Wraith nodded at appropriate intervals, his massive frame making the bar stool look like children's furniture. His silence was as much a part of the bar's atmosphere as the music, a presence rather than an absence. When he did speak, everyone listened. But tonight wasn't a speaking night. Hazard sat at his usual corner position, back to the wall, sightlines to both entrances. The habit hadn't faded in the decades since his last deployment. His fingers occasionally brushed against the dog tags hidden beneath his shirt, an unconscious ritual when memories surfaced too close to the present. Boone leaned against the pool table, calculating angles for a shot he wasn't particularly invested in making. His jokes never matched the shadows that lingered in his eyes. Humor deployed as strategic cover for whatever lay beneath. They were the core members of the Desert Ghosts, men bound by experiences that civilians could never understand and they rarely discussed. Their motorcycle club had evolved from military unit to civilian brotherhood. Membership limited to those who had seen the world's ugliest corners and returned carrying pieces of those places within them. "Another round?" Trigger asked, already reaching for the bottle that matched each man's preference. The familiar question formed part of the evening's liturgy, a ritual that created structure in lives that sometimes lacked it. The front door creaked open, hinges protesting as they had since Reagan was president. A shaft of dying sunlight cut through the smoke-filled room, momentarily transforming dust motes into floating embers. Conversations paused reflexively. Strangers rarely found the Rusty Spoke by accident, and newcomers were assessed before being welcomed. The silence extended beyond its usual duration as the regulars processed what they were seeing. A small figure stood silhouetted in the doorway, clearly a child, something that had never happened in the bar's long history. As the door swung closed behind her, the gathering dusk revealed a girl no older than 10, her serious eyes scanning the room with unsettling intensity. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, dust from the road clinging to worn sneakers. She wore a backpack that appeared to contain everything she deemed essential, and a military-issue jacket that swallowed her small frame, the sleeves rolled up multiple times to free her hands. The name tape reading Mason was faded but still legible against the camouflage pattern. The child stepped forward, and the artificial confidence in her posture revealed itself as determination rather than comfort. The bar's usual soundtrack, ice in glasses, pool balls clicking, murmured conversations, had completely ceased. Even the jukebox seemed to lower its volume in recognition of the strange tableau unfolding. "This ain't a place for kids," Trigger said, his voice gentle but firm. "You lost, little one?" The girl didn't respond immediately. Her gaze moved methodically around the room, taking inventory of each man present before settling back on Trigger. There was something unsettlingly familiar in her assessment, a tactical evaluation that children shouldn't possess. When she moved farther into the bar, the overhead light revealed what she clutched in her right hand, a service pistol too large for her small grip, but held with grim determination. The weapon transformed the unusual situation into something potentially dangerous. Trigger set down the glass he'd been polishing with deliberate calm. "That's not a toy, kid. Why don't you put it down before someone gets hurt?" "Which one of you knew my father?" The question emerged quiet but clear, her voice steady despite the slight tremor in her hands. The effect on the assembled veterans was immediate and electric. Faulkner halted mid-anecdote, recognition flashing across his features before being carefully masked. Wraith straightened imperceptibly, his massive frame tensing with sudden alertness. Boone abandoned any pretense of interest in his pool game, subtly shifting position to block the exit. Not to trap the child, but to prevent her escape before they understood what was happening. Trigger studied the girl more carefully now, noting details he'd initially missed: the determined set of her jaw, the way she held herself, the particular shade of her eyes that triggered memories he'd spent years trying to bury beneath alcohol and routine. "You want to tell us your name, sweetheart?" Trigger asked, his tone carefully neutral. "Ember," she replied, the gun unwavering in her grip. "Ember Mason." The name rippled through the room, confirming suspicions that had begun forming the moment she stepped inside. Several of the men exchanged loaded glances, silent communications born of decades serving together. "Your daddy was a soldier," Trigger stated rather than asked. "Sergeant Thorne Mason," Ember confirmed. 82nd Airborne, then Special Forces, then something else they won't tell Mom about. Hazard's hand moved unconsciously to his concealed dog tags, the motion catching Ember's attention. Her gaze sharpened, registering the gesture and its potential significance. "He wore those too," she said, nodding toward Hazard's chest. "I have his. They sent them back in a box with his uniform and medals." The girl's simple description landed with physical force among the veterans. Each had attended too many memorial services, folded too many flags, witnessed too many personal effects, returned to families in impersonal containers. "Your mom know you're here, Ember?" Trigger asked, already suspecting the answer. "Mom thinks I'm at soccer practice," she replied without hesitation. "She works double shifts at the hospital on Fridays. I took 3 buses to get here." The logistics of a 10-year-old navigating public transportation alone, while carrying a firearm, raised alarming questions about her determination and resources. Whatever had driven her to this moment went beyond childish impulse. "That's a long way to travel by yourself," Faulkner observed, his usual boisterous tone subdued. "Must be something mighty important." Ember's attention shifted from Trigger, her eyes scanning the walls of the bar with sudden intensity. The Rusty Spoke's interior served as a museum of sorts. Decades of Desert Ghosts membership captured in faded photographs, patches, license plates, and memorabilia from military deployments and cross-country rides. She moved toward the western wall where the oldest photographs hung, the gun still gripped firmly despite her obvious fatigue. The men remained motionless, aware that sudden movements might escalate an already precarious situation. "I found a picture," she said, studying the frames intently. "In Mom's closet, Dad with a motorcycle group in Afghanistan. She didn't know I saw it." The revelation increased the tension in the room. Most military families received carefully curated versions of their loved ones' service, particularly when classified operations were involved. That Ember had discovered evidence of connections her mother wasn't aware of suggested she had been assembling pieces of a puzzle the adults in her life had deliberately kept disassembled. Trigger exchanged a glance with Wraith, a silent question passing between them. How much did this child know? How much should she know? "That's a bar, not a daycare," came a voice from a corner table where three locals sat nursing beers. "Someone call her parents before this gets any weirder." The comment broke the focused silence that had enveloped the main group. Trigger's expression hardened slightly as he turned toward the speaker. "Finish your drinks and head out, gentlemen. We're closing early tonight." The authority in his voice brooked no argument. The locals grumbled but complied. Years of witnessing the Desert Ghost's tight-knit solidarity, teaching them when not to push back. They settled their tabs quickly and departed, the door swinging shut behind them, with a finality that emphasized the confrontation now distilled to its essential participants. Ember barely registered the departure, her attention fixed on the photographs. Her scrutiny had the focus of a search and rescue operation, methodical and desperate simultaneously. The gun lowered slightly as concentration overtook her initial, confrontational stance. "Why are you here, Ember?" Trigger asked directly. "What are you looking for?" Her response came without her turning from the wall. "Answers. Mom got a letter she didn't know I found. Someone wrote that they left him behind when things got bad. I want to know who left my dad behind." The accusation landed in the center of the room, heavy as a mortar shell, and potentially as devastating. The Desert Ghosts had survived combat together, had built civilian lives together, had carried each other through nightmares and divorces and rehabilitation. The suggestion that they had abandoned one of their own violated everything that defined them. Yet, none of them immediately denied it. The silence that followed Ember's statement contained something more complex than indignation, a weighted consideration that suggested truths not easily articulated. "Found it," Ember whispered suddenly, her voice cutting through the tense quiet. She stepped closer to a particular frame, studying it with fierce concentration. The photograph, taken 3 years earlier, showed a group of younger desert ghosts, in combat fatigues, arms around each other's shoulders, standing before a military transport aircraft. Despite dust and tactical gear, their expressions showed the particular brotherhood of men who have repeatedly trusted each other with their lives. At the center, his smile bright against the desert landscape, stood Sergeant Thorne Mason, the unmistakable origin of Ember's determined eyes and set jaw. "That's him," she said, raising the gun to point at the photograph, her voice breaking for the first time since she'd entered the bar. "You left him behind." The words hung in the air as the Desert Ghosts stared at the image of their fallen brother, and the living extension of him who now confronted them with a child's righteous anger and a weapon that symbolized the violence that had separated them. The resemblance between father and daughter became unmistakable once identified. Not just physical features, but the particular intensity, the focused determination that had made Thorne Mason both an exceptional soldier and a complicated man. What had this child discovered that brought her here alone, armed and afraid? What had truly happened to Sergeant Mason, and why did his daughter believe these men, his brothers in all but blood, had betrayed him when he needed them most? Silence gripped the rusty spoke, heavy as armor plate and just as impenetrable. The Desert Ghosts remained motionless, weathered faces revealing nothing while processing everything. Only the hum of the ancient refrigerator behind the bar and the distant whisper of highway traffic penetrated the standoff between the child with the gun and the veterans she accused. Trigger was the first to recover, decades of managing volatile situations taking over. He kept his hands visible on the bar's surface, movements deliberate and voice measured. "Put the gun down, kid. Nobody here wants trouble." "I'm not here for trouble," Ember replied, the weapon still directed toward the photograph rather than any person. "I'm here for the truth." The distinction mattered, suggesting this wasn't about revenge but understanding, potentially more dangerous, as simple answers wouldn't satisfy. The clarity in her young voice carried the unmistakable echo of her father's command presence, a genetic inheritance as tangible as her auburn hair and determined jaw. "Truth's a complicated thing," Trigger said, carefully gauging the distance between himself and the child, especially in war. Ember's focus remained unwavering. "Mom said he was coming home, then the men in uniforms came instead. They gave her a flag." Each word emerged precise as rifle fire, striking vulnerable targets. "She cries at night when she thinks I'm sleeping." The simple description landed with devastating impact. Every man present had witnessed that scene from the other side, the official notification, the ceremonial flag, the shattered family left behind. but experiencing it through the eyes of this child created a new dimension of understanding. His things came back in boxes, she continued, emotion beginning to destabilize her carefully constructed composure. But there was a picture of all of you, and this. With her free hand, she gestured toward the oversized jacket she wore, her father's name still visible on the faded tape. The military jacket hung on her small frame like borrowed armor, both protection and memorial. The symbolism wasn't lost on the veterans. Ember literally wrapped herself in her father's identity, carrying his memory as a physical presence. "That gun," Hazard observed, his voice rough from decades of smoke and desert dust. "Your daddy's service weapon?" Ember nodded, revealing another piece of the puzzle. Personal sidearms weren't typically returned to families with personal effects, suggesting irregularities in how Sergeant Mason's death had been processed, or that someone in the military chain had broken protocol to ensure his daughter received this connection to him. "Where'd you find it?" Hazard pressed, his question carrying more significance than mere curiosity. "Gun safe in the garage. Mom doesn't know the combination, but Dad taught me." Her expression flickered with momentary pride before hardening again. "I found the bullets in his fishing tackle box." The systematic way she'd assembled her mission, locating the weapon, ammunition, transportation to the bar, spoke to both her father's influence and her own resourcefulness. This wasn't impulsive. It was planned with unsettling thoroughness for a 10-year-old. Faulkner approached slowly, his usual boisterous personality subdued by the gravity of the moment. "Your daddy was a hell of a soldier, kid, the best of us." "Then why did you leave him?" Ember demanded, cutting through diplomatic language with the direct precision of childhood. "Mom found letters. Someone wrote that they left Thorne behind when things got bad. Was it you?" The accusation hung between them, the central mystery that had driven this child to such desperate measures. The veterans exchanged loaded glances, a silent conversation about boundaries and secrets and what this daughter deserved to know about her father's final moments. Their hesitation confirmed her suspicions, strengthening her resolve. The gun, which had begun to waver with fatigue, steadied again in her small hands. Outside, the desert wind picked up, whistling through the building's aging joints with a mournful keening. The weather's shift mirrored the emotional current inside. What had been stagnant was now in motion, forces building toward inevitable collision. Trigger moved deliberately toward the bar, telegraphing each movement to avoid alarming Ember. "Your name is Ember, isn't it?" he asked, though he clearly already knew the answer. "Your daddy talked about you all the time, said you were named for the spark in your eyes when you were born." The personal detail caught her off guard, creating the first crack in her certainty. Her eyebrows drew together, processing this evidence that these men might have known her father more intimately than she'd considered. "How do you know that?" she asked, confusion momentarily displacing anger. "Because he told us," Trigger replied simply. "During long nights on watch, during sandstorms that kept us pinned down, during those quiet moments before missions when men talk about what matters most." He reached beneath the counter, movement slow and non-threatening. "He carried your picture everywhere." Instead of a weapon, Trigger withdrew an old cigar box, its wooden surface polished by years of handling. He placed it carefully on the bar counter, not opening it yet. "There's things about your father you should know. Things we've kept to ourselves maybe too long." The box itself became an immediate focal point, a physical manifestation of withheld information, of memories contained rather than shared. Its presence changed the dynamic in the room, offering potential answers while promising more questions. Wraith, who had maintained his characteristic silence until now, shifted his massive frame with deliberate care. His movement drew Ember's attention, the gun tracking momentarily toward him before returning to its original position. "Little Spark," he said, using what was evidently a nickname so intimate it made Ember flinch. "That's what he called you in his letters, said you were just like your mother, stubborn, smart, stronger than you looked." The revelation landed with visible impact. These men knew not just her father, but aspects of her own identity, connections she hadn't anticipated when planning her confrontation. The gun lowered slightly, emotional certainty beginning to blur against unexpected complexity. Outside, the wind continued strengthening, rattling the bar's weather-beaten sign. Dust devils swirled across the parking lot, mirroring the emotional turbulence building within. The desert environment, normally indifferent to human concerns, seemed to respond to the gathering storm of revelation and reckoning. Boone, who had positioned himself near the door throughout the standoff, spoke for the first time. "How'd you find us, kid? This place isn't exactly on tourist maps." "Dad's journal," Ember replied after a moment's hesitation. "Mom doesn't know I found it. He wrote about this place, said it was where desert ghosts came when they couldn't sleep, when the sand wouldn't wash out of their dreams." Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Sergeant Mason had documented his connections to these men, had left breadcrumbs his daughter eventually followed. Whether intentional or accidental, he'd created a path that led her to this moment, to these men, to potential answers about his death. "Smart kid," Boone observed, respect evident beneath caution. "Just like your old man." Hazard moved deliberately toward the wall of photographs, his attention focused on a particular frame Ember hadn't yet noticed. He tapped the glass with one finger, drawing her gaze to what it contained. Not a photograph, but a Purple Heart medal preserved behind glass, with SGT Thorne Mason engraved on its back. "Your father was a hero, kid," Hazard said, his gruff voice softening slightly. "That's the official story, and it's true as far as it goes. But it's not the whole truth." The statement expanded the mystery rather than resolving it. If her father had been recognized as a hero, awarded medals for his service and sacrifice, why did documentation suggest his brothers in arms had abandoned him? What wasn't contained in the official story that these men had carried as private burden for years? Trigger placed his weathered hands on the cigar box, but didn't immediately open it. "When your daddy joined our unit, he was already a legend. 3 combat tours, more confirmed kills than most snipers see in a career, commendations that don't exist in public records." He paused, assessing how much this child could or should know. "But that's not what made him special." "What did?" Ember asked, drawn into the narrative despite her determination to remain aloof. "He remembered everyone's birthdays," Trigger answered with unexpected simplicity. "Carried extra water for local kids, learned enough language to thank people properly, treated every person, friend or enemy, like they mattered." This portrayal of her father's humanity rather than his combat prowess clearly affected Ember. The gun lowered further, her weapon hand now resting at her side, though still gripping the pistol. The bar's dim lighting caught the moisture gathering in her eyes, determination battling emotion. "If he was so special," she managed, voice catching slightly, "why didn't you bring him home?" The question hung between them, the central accusation that had driven this extraordinary confrontation. Rather than answering directly, Trigger finally opened the cigar box, revealing its contents for Ember to see. Inside lay a collection of items carefully preserved: photographs, handwritten letters, a desert camo bandana, a small notebook with a bullet hole through its cover, and most significantly, a set of dog tags identical to the ones Ember wore beneath her shirt, a detail only now becoming visible as her jacket shifted with her movements. "You're wearing his tags," Trigger observed, not surprised but confirming. Ember's free hand moved unconsciously to her neck, fingers finding the metal identification that represented her most tangible connection to her father. "Mom doesn't know I have these either. They're supposed to be in the shadow box with his medals." "He had a spare set," Trigger explained, indicating the matching tags in the box. "Your daddy gave me these before our last mission, said if anything happened, I should make sure they got back to you and your mom." The revelation landed with physical impact, the implication of premeditation sending a chill through the room. Thorne Mason had anticipated something his brothers hadn't, had prepared for a possibility they'd refused to consider. The dog tags became symbolic connectors between past and present, father and daughter, promises made and potentially broken. Boone approached from his position by the door, his casual demeanor replaced by uncharacteristic seriousness. "Your mom got one version of events, Ember, the official report. We got another, what we lived through. Neither tells the whole story." This framing further complicated the narrative, suggesting layers of truth and documentation that contained contradictions or omissions. Government records, personal experience, and family notification had created parallel versions of Sergeant Mason's death, none of them complete. The wind outside had reached howling intensity, sand and small debris striking the building's exterior like distant gunfire. The desert itself seemed to demand resolution, atmospheric pressure building, toward inevitable release. Inside, emotional currents mirrored the weather, volatile, intensifying, approaching critical threshold. "I want to know what happened," Ember stated, her initial accusation transforming into plea. "I need to know." Trigger exchanged glances with his fellow veterans, a silent communication based on decades of shared experience. Each man nodded slightly, recognizing the moment of decision had arrived. Some truths couldn't remain buried, especially when they sent determined children on dangerous journeys for answers. "I think it's time," Trigger concluded, closing the cigar box and gathering it in his gnarled hands. He gestured toward a door behind the bar, leading to a private back room. "I think it's time you heard what really happened that day in Kandahar. Not the story the military told your mom, not the story we've been telling ourselves, but the truth your father would want you to know." The invitation represented a significant shift in power and narrative, from confrontation to potential collaboration, from accusation to shared exploration of painful history. Ember stood motionless, weighing her options with the careful calculation she'd clearly inherited from her father. "The gun stays here," Wraith stated, not a request, but a condition. He extended his massive hand, palm up, waiting with the patience of mountains. For a long moment, the outcome remained uncertain. Then, with the reluctance of someone surrendering their only protection, Ember placed the weapon in Wraith's outstretched hand. The transfer happened with surprising ceremony, a formal exchange that acknowledged both the seriousness of her actions and the respect with which these veterans now treated her. As Trigger led the way toward the back room, the desert ghosts forming a protective circle around Sergeant Mason's daughter, the wind suddenly ceased its assault on the building. The abrupt silence emphasized the gravity of what was about to be revealed. Weather and emotion simultaneously paused before inevitable storm. Inside the private room, a space usually reserved for card games and confidential conversations, the atmosphere felt both protective and confessional. Dark wood walls displayed more intimate memorabilia than the public bar, personal photographs and mementos too meaningful for casual viewing. A worn American flag hung in one corner, and beneath it, a shadow box containing patches from fallen brothers, empty spaces waiting for eventual additions. Trigger placed the cigar box on the scarred table as Ember took a seat, her small frame dwarfed by the heavy wooden chair. The veterans arranged themselves around her, not as captors, but as guardians of painful memory about to be shared. As Trigger reached to open the box fully, revealing contents beyond what Ember had glimpsed earlier, his sleeve pulled back slightly. The movement exposed a tattoo on his inner wrist, a set of coordinates followed by initials. TM. Ember's sharp eyes caught the marking immediately, her gaze tracking to the other men's wrists, where identical tattoos became visible as they settled around the table. The realization dawned with stunning clarity. These men hadn't forgotten her father or abandoned his memory. They carried him permanently marked into their skin, his location and identity literally inscribed on their bodies. The discovery raised the most troubling question yet. What had happened in Kandahar that drove these men to such permanent commemoration while simultaneously preventing them from sharing the truth with Sergeant Mason's family? What terrible burden had they been carrying for 3 years that required both eternal remembrance and complete silence? Trigger opened the cigar box fully, arranging its contents on the scarred table with reverent precision. Beyond the items Ember had glimpsed earlier lay her father's actual Desert Ghosts patch, worn thin along the edges from the constant wear, modified with his blood type and personal call sign. The sight of it, tangible evidence of her father's connection to these men, caused her breath to catch audibly. 3 years ago, Trigger began without preamble, your father led a reconnaissance mission in Kandahar province. Off the books, not officially sanctioned. Intelligence had located a high-value target, but conventional forces couldn't move fast enough. Your father volunteered our unit. All of us had served together before. All trusted each other with our lives. His voice carried the measured cadence of military briefings, facts presented clearly without emotional coloration. The other Desert Ghosts remained silent, allowing Trigger to serve as narrator of their shared experience. This wasn't our first rodeo, he continued. We'd done similar operations, always came home intact. Your daddy made sure of it. He'd earned the nickname Ghost Father among the younger guys, the one who always brought his people back, no matter what. Ember's eyes widened slightly at this detail, another facet of her father's identity, previously unknown to her. In her limited understanding, shaped by a grieving mother's careful filtering and military officialdom's sanitized accounts, Sergeant Thorne Mason had existed primarily as absence and loss. Now he was being reconstructed as presence and legacy. The mission went sideways almost immediately, Wraith interjected, his deep voice resonating in the small room. Bad intel, ambush waiting, communication equipment damage in the first exchange. Ember shifted in her chair, attention completely captured. The gun that had served as both weapon and shield lay forgotten on the bar outside, no longer necessary in her search for truth. We were compromised, Trigger confirmed. Extraction point was hot, known to the enemy, communications cut off, backup unable to reach our position. The staccato phrases painted a dire tactical situation, each element compounding the danger the unit had faced. Your father assessed the situation, Hazard continued, taking up the narrative thread. 8 of us, at least 30 hostiles between us and any potential extraction. Limited ammunition, 2 of our unit wounded. Including me, Faulkner admitted, rolling up his sleeve to reveal a jagged scar traversing his forearm. Took shrapnel from an RPG, was losing blood fast. Your daddy patched me up on the move, carried my pack along with his own when I started to fade. The personal testimony transformed the abstract mission account into intimate human experience. Ember's gaze fixed on Faulkner's scar, physical evidence of the situation's desperation and her father's actions under pressure. Boone leaned forward, hands clasped on the table. We had limited options, most of them bad. Standard procedure would have been to split up, increase odds of some of us making it to secondary extraction point. But your father wouldn't consider it, Trigger said. He believed in all home or none home, always had. The phrase clearly carried weight among the veterans, a personal code rather than military directive. Ember mouthed the words silently, recognizing their significance while integrating this new understanding of her father's character. He found another way, Wraith said, his usual reticence broken by the importance of accurate testimony. Secondary extraction point was 6 clicks southeast, heavily guarded approach. But your daddy spotted a drainage culvert on the satellite maps, running parallel to the main road. Tight squeeze, risky as hell, but possible. The tactical details might have overwhelmed a typical 10-year-old, but Ember followed with focused attention, her father's daughter in her analytical approach as much as her appearance. The problem, Trigger continued, was getting everyone through that culvert while maintaining rear security. Someone had to stay behind, create a diversion to draw enemy forces away from our exit route. Understanding began dawning on Ember's face, her expression shifting as implications became clear. The narrative was building toward the critical moment that had separated these men from her father, the decision point that had haunted both sides of the story. Your father ordered us to proceed through the culvert while he created the diversion, Hazard stated, his voice rough with contained emotion. Direct order, no room for argument. We argued anyway. I told him it was suicide, Faulkner admitted, that we'd find another way. He just smiled that smile of his and said, "There is another way. I'm showing it to you." The quoted words landed with visible impact on Ember, recognition flashing across her features. Perhaps she'd heard similar phrases from him in civilian contexts, wisdom consistent across his roles as soldier and father. He didn't give us a choice, Boone added. He pulled rank. Said as commanding officer, he was making the tactical decision. Said getting 7 men home was better than losing 8. Trigger reached into the cigar box again, withdrawing a folded paper, worn thin along its creases from repeated handling. The night before the mission, your daddy gave me this, along with his spare tags. Said he had a bad feeling. Wanted to make sure certain things got handled if he couldn't do it himself. He placed the paper on the table without unfolding it. It's a letter for your mom, never delivered. When we reported what happened, our commanding officer said it would complicate the narrative. Said your father's actions weren't technically authorized, that including his personal correspondence might raise questions about operation parameters. The implication hung heavy. Official accounts had been sanitized not to protect national security, but institutional reputation. The letter represented both promise unfulfilled and potential healing long delayed. Your father didn't get left behind, kid, Hazard stated with quiet intensity. ensuring Ember understood the critical truth. He stayed behind, forced us to go, said it was the only way any of us were making it home. The distinction made all the difference. Not abandonment, but sacrifice. Not dereliction, but dedication to brothers in arms. Ember's shoulders sagged slightly as anger that had fueled her dangerous journey transformed into grief unleavened by misunderstanding or resentment. "What happened to him?" she asked, voice small but steady. The veterans exchanged glances, a silent communication about appropriate details for a child's ears. Trigger nodded slightly, authorizing the unvarnished truth. "He led the enemy away from our position," Wraith explained, "created multiple distractions that kept them occupied long enough for us to get through the culvert and reach the secondary extraction point. Last radio transmission indicated he was surrounded but still moving. Recovery teams found him 3 days later," Trigger continued gently. "He'd taken out 11 hostiles before they got him. Died of his wounds rather than enemy execution. He never gave up our position or the extraction route. Never broke, even at the end." Tears filled Ember's eyes, but she didn't look away or break down. The composure spoke to both her father's influence and her own strength. Grief acknowledged, but not surrendered to. "After we made it back, we reported exactly what happened," Boone said. "But the official account got sanitized. Unsanctioned mission became approved operation. Your father's sacrifice became killed in action during standard patrol. His final transmission and letter never made it into official records." "The medal citation tells half the story," Hazard added, gesturing toward the Purple Heart displayed on the wall. "The part they could acknowledge without admitting the rest." One by one, the desert ghosts rolled up their sleeves, revealing the matching tattoos Ember had glimpsed earlier. Each bore identical coordinates, the location of Sergeant Mason's last stand, followed by his initials and blood type. "We couldn't tell the world what he did," Trigger explained, "but we made sure none of us would ever forget." The visual confirmation of their permanent memorial transformed the narrative completely. These weren't men who had abandoned their brother. They were custodians of his memory, carrying his sacrifice literally inscribed on their bodies. Their silence hadn't been denial, but protection. Of classified information, yes, but more importantly, of his legacy. "When they gave your mom that folded flag," Faulkner said, "we wanted to be there, to tell her what really happened. But we were deployed again immediately after, and by the time we returned, certain decisions had been made above our pay grade." Ember absorbed this information with the seriousness of someone much older, connecting disparate pieces into coherent understanding. "The letter Mom found," she said after a moment. "Someone wrote that they left Thorne behind when things got bad." "Who wrote that?" "I did," Trigger admitted without hesitation. "To my wife, trying to process my own guilt for following his orders, for leaving him there. The letter was never meant for anyone else to see." He met Ember's gaze directly. "I've carried that moment every day since. We all have. But there's a difference between leaving someone and being forced to go, so others might live." Understanding dawned fully on Ember's face, misinterpretation replaced by clarity. The letter that had driven her desperate quest had been an expression of survivor's guilt rather than accusation of abandonment. Her father hadn't been betrayed. He had made the ultimate choice that defined leadership. Trigger carefully removed one more item from the cigar box, a custom-made pendant containing a miniature version of Thorne's patch, sized appropriately for a child. "Your father had this made before deployment," he explained. "Said someday his little girl might want to know who he rode with, who had his back." He offered it to Ember with formal reverence, the gesture representing more than simple gift-giving. "He wanted you to have this when you were old enough to understand what it meant to be part of something bigger than yourself." Ember accepted the pendant with both hands, studying it with the same intensity she'd shown when examining photographs earlier. Her small fingers traced the embroidered symbols, connecting physically with her father's legacy. When she looked up at the assembled veterans, her expression had transformed, no longer accusatory but grateful, no longer angry but seeking connection. "Did he say anything?" she asked softly. At the end, Faulkner, who had remained uncharacteristically subdued throughout the revelation, finally spoke. "He said he was going home. We thought he meant if he made it out." His voice broke slightly. Later we realized he meant something else. He knew exactly what he was doing. The statement provided profound comfort. Thorn Mason had made his choice with clear understanding, trading his life for his brother's, finding peace in that decision rather than fear. It was the most honest eulogy these men could offer his daughter. 1 week later, the Rusty Spoke hosted an unusual gathering. The typical Friday crowd was present, but with significant additions. Ember sat at a table near the wall of photographs, where a new addition had been prominently displayed. The photograph showed Sergeant Thorn Mason in full desert combat gear, smiling despite harsh conditions. Beside him stood a woman with Ember's auburn hair, her mother, Laurel Mason. Laurel sat across from Trigger, their conversation quiet but intense. Initially reluctant to enter this unfamiliar world, she now engaged directly with her late husband's brothers-in-arms, finding answers to questions that had haunted her grief for years. The undelivered letter, finally in her possession, lay open beside her, its contents private but clearly meaningful. Around them, the desert ghosts moved with the relaxed camaraderie of men whose burden had lightened. The bar that had served as sanctuary for their shared silence now functioned as space for communal healing. Memories no longer buried, but honored through accurate retelling. Near the jukebox, Ember stood with Hazard, who demonstrated how to select songs. The gruff veteran who rarely spoke to strangers now bent toward the child with patient explanation, their connection forged through shared love for a man neither would see again, but both carried within them. "Your daddy loved this one," Hazard said, cueing a Creedence Clearwater Revival track. "Used to hum it during night watches, drove us all crazy." The fond complaint revealed more about their brotherhood than any formal account could capture. Ember smiled, not happily exactly, but with genuine warmth. "He used to sing it in the garage while working on his motorcycle. Mom said he couldn't carry a tune in a bucket." The shared memory created another thread of connection between the military and civilian aspects of Thorn Mason's life, two worlds that should never have been separated, now joining in mutual understanding. Outside the bar's windows, desert sunset painted the landscape in gold and crimson, the same colors that had illuminated countless patrols and operations during the Desert Ghost's deployments. The harsh environment that had claimed Sergeant Mason's life now provided beautiful backdrop for his legacy's continuation. In the parking lot, the veterans' motorcycles stood in formation, now joined by Laurel's modest sedan, different vehicles sharing common purpose and destination. What had begun with a child's desperate quest for answers had transformed into an extended family connected by sacrifice and remembrance. As evening deepened into night, Ember moved to stand before her father's newly displayed photograph. Around her neck hung the pendant Trigger had given her, visible proof of her connection to both her father and the brotherhood he had valued enough to die for. She studied his features not with confusion or anger, but with quiet pride, understanding now the full measure of the man whose absence had shaped her young life. Trigger joined her, his bartender's cloth forgotten, as he stood in silent companionship with Sergeant Mason's daughter. "You're very much like him, you know," he observed quietly. "Not just how you look, the way you think, the way you never quit until you get answers." "Mom says that too," Ember replied, a small smile forming. "Says I'm stubborn as a desert sandstorm." "High praise coming from your mother," Trigger noted with answering smile. "She's got plenty of grit herself." The three qualities, her father's determination, her mother's resilience, her own developing strength, formed complete inheritance, genes and values transmitted despite death's intervention. The gun that had served as Ember's shield against uncertainty now seemed childish and unnecessary, replaced by something far more powerful: understanding. At closing time, as Laurel prepared to take her daughter home, Ember paused in the doorway where her extraordinary confrontation had begun. The threshold now represented not invasion, but connection, not accusation, but reconciliation. She turned back toward the assembled desert ghosts, who had formed an informal honor guard for their departure. "Will you tell me more about him?" she asked, the question containing both request and permission to remember publicly what they had carried privately for too long. "Every chance we get, little spark," Faulkner promised, using the nickname that now connected rather than separated them. "Every single chance we get." As mother and daughter departed, the Rusty Spoke settled back into familiar rhythms, but with subtle differences. The hidden grief that had hung in layers with the cigarette smoke had dissipated, replaced by something lighter, yet more substantial. The desert ghosts had recovered not just their ability to speak their brother's name, but their connection to his, continuing legacy through his daughter. The photograph of Sergeant Thorne Mason caught the bar's dim light, his smile preserved across time and circumstance. But now that smile seemed directed not just toward memory, but toward future, toward his daughter carrying his dog tags, his wife holding his final letter, his brothers honoring his choice. What had been buried in silence now lived in shared understanding, proving that even in death, no soldier is truly left behind when their story finds its way home.